So before I start the reading, I'm going to say I am a Reading Rainbow generation child. Some of you may remember this. One of my biggest challenges whenever I hear other people speak is they mention a really good book in passing in the sermon, and we're right on to the topic, which was fascinating, and I don't have time to write down the title and go back and read it. So this is more of a multimedia sermon, multimedia service. So I'm going to hold up the books I talk about when I'm talking about them, and then if you're in the sanctuary and you want to see the book afterwards, I have them, and if you're online, send an email to the church office and I can give you the citation. Okay, but as LeVar Burton says, you don't have to take my word for it. So, our reading comes from the first book of Erlagawe Myths by Robert L. Trayer. Here it is. By 1732, the Deutsch colonists, Pennsylvania Dutch, had entered the area now known as Lynn Township, Pennsylvania, and they began a rapid process of settlement. They cleared huge tracts of lands of tree and brush, they built houses, and they built farms. Unfortunately, they quickly discovered that the soil in this particular area was not as fertile as others, and the settlers experienced their first major drought. When the rains came and washed away the soil, it took with them the seeds and the few seedlings that had managed to grow. Between the drought and the crop failure, the colonists were particularly desperate because all the wildlife had run over to the other side of Blue Mountain. The early autumn snowstorms trapped the settlers on their lands, and they became increasingly desperate as they were starving and began to pray and lay out meager offerings of hay and cloth. Just as sickness and starvation began to set in, the cold mid-autumn night was broken by a booming voice and an overwhelming howling and barking of hounds. The noise seemed to come from everywhere, yet nowhere. And when the people were terrified, they hid all through the black night in their shelters, wondering what was going on. As dawn approached, the settlers crept out of their homes, and they looked at the barren fields, and they saw that wildlife that had been long gone was back. Deer and rabbit were suddenly plentiful, so the farmers took to hunting and preserving the meat for the winter. All through the long winter, the sound of the hunting pack could be heard across Blabarek, the Blue Mountain. The magnitude of the sound never wavered, and the folk knew that Iwich Yeager, the eternal hunter, had rescued them from certain starvation. To this day, in parts of Blue Mountain, when the roaring and barking howls of Iwich Yeager's hunting pack is heard, the Pennsylvania Dutch folk know that the eternal hunter continues his errands, keeping the hunting lands of Pennsylvania rich and fertile. So, once upon a time, the land was rich and green. Birds filled the skies, fish filled the streams, animals and insects darted among the trees and across the meadows. The newcomers called it paradise, with food and farms for the taking. They called it the fat of the land. But then things changed. The grandchildren of the newcomers heard about flocks of birds that covered the sky, but they saw only a few and struggled to catch even those. They heard about forests so dense that you could barely step into them, but they had no trees for fuel now. They heard of rich soils for crops, but their fields mostly grew stones, and their children went hungry, and they wondered what went wrong. In some places, the Pennsylvania Dutch still tell the story of Iwich Yeager, the eternal hunter. In that story, the settlers understood exactly what had happened. Clear cutting destroyed the mountain soils, which dried out and then washed away. Only the intervention of the eternal hunter saved the settlers from starvation. While Iwich Yeager can still sometimes be heard in the mountains of Pennsylvania, salvation would not necessarily come a second time. the people of Lynn Township had to devise a better strategy for caring for their lands. Across the ocean, in the harsh climate of Iceland, farmers and fishermen lived on the ragged edge of nature. Winters were long and dark, summers were short and cool. Within 200 years, the first settlers had cut down all the trees in Iceland, leaving the soil exposed to erosion. The 500-year-long Little Ice Age shortened the growing season even more. And then from June 1783 to February 1784, the Laki fissure exploded, releasing poisonous gases and dust particles. Up to 80% of the livestock and a quarter of the humans died in the famine called Mathardaran, the mist of hardship. In the long, long winter nights, the Icelanders told stories around the fire. Famous for their history sagas, the people kept a rich collection of folk tales as well about the other-than-human people who shared their harsh and beautiful land. Some stories are famous, tied to dramatic places in the landscape, like the boiling pools at Gunnaver. The mud pools are haunted by the angry ghost of Gunna, a desperately poor woman who starved to death after her landlord took her only possession, her iron pot, in payment for rent. When she returned as a vengeful ghost, the priest had a ball of magic yarn rolled into the mud pools. Gunna followed it and became trapped in a place where she could rage but do no more harm. Other stories belong to particular fields on local farms. In her book, Looking for the Hidden Folk, How Iceland's Elves Can Save the Earth, Nancy Marie Brown shares the tale of Elias Kjarnason, who owned a farm on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula in western Iceland from 1856 to 1860. One day, Elias decided to clear stones from the corner of a field of his farm for new pasture. That night, a beautiful elf woman came to him in a dream and asked him to stop. But the next morning, Elias went on with his work. Again, he dreamed of the beautiful elf maiden, asking him to stop breaking stones. Again, Elias cleared more ground. The elf woman came to his wife in her dreams, begging her to make her husband stop. But Elias kept going. At last, the elf woman told Elias's wife that her husband was responsible for the consequences of his actions. The dreams stopped, but the livestock began dying. First, all the horses in the seaside pasture fell dead. Then 70 of the sheep died. Bad luck continued until at last the Kjarnasteds abandoned their farm and eventually immigrated to North America. Elias's great-great-grandson, the UU minister Stefan Janusson, and his family have returned to Iceland to visit the farm several times over the years. Reverend Janusson wrote, "We saw some of the toughest lava-strewn terrain imaginable and wondered why Elias thought he could carve out a living there. We weren't bothered by the Hulda folk, the elf folk, but perhaps they were simply watching and laughing at us from afar." Reverend Janusson describes himself as an elf skeptic who does not believe in magical spirit beings hiding in the rocks. Nevertheless, he agrees with author Alda Sigmundsdóttir that Icelandic folklore at its core reflects the plight of a nation living in abject poverty on the edge of the habitable world and its people's efforts to survive physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Humans make sense of the world through stories. We tell ourselves stories all day long. I'm making this particular apple pie recipe for family Thanksgiving because my brother David gave it to me, and it reminds us of cooking together when we were children. We vote in every election, not only because it's how democracy works, but also because our founding mothers and fathers fought for the right to vote over centuries, and we recognize their sacrifices. Or, more insidiously, consumer culture tells the story that if we buy the next big thing, the new phone, the pretty shirt, we will feel like whole, meaningful people until the next big thing comes along. Each story has an underlying set of messages, of values, some that are helpful in building self-worth, family, community, and some that are more destructive, reinforcing the empty gnaw of overconsumption and bitter competition. In Iceland, the angry ghost of Gunna reminds us that maybe not to take the last pot of a starving woman. Find another way to get your rent, one that builds community rather than tearing it apart. The elf woman in Elias's farm spoke ecological truth. Elias's farm probably could not support his animals. Iceland's fragile environment requires wild, uncultivated areas where native plants can hold thin soil and birds and pollinators can flourish. Whether the Hulda folk truly live in a parallel world to humans, or whether they represent the needs of the ecosystem, the effect remains the same. Leave space for the other than human beings to keep ecology in a sustainable balance. Take away the last elf field and the farm fails. The ecological edge between success and failure is simply that thin. Traditionally, most human societies assumed the consciousness and agency of the more than human world. Theologians call this religious position animism. Those of us who have pets can relate. That's my pet Forks. Clearly, our dog or cat or lizard is more than a dumb animal. Each has a distinct personality. We play together, love each other. In a Pew Research poll, nearly 97% of people surveyed reported that their pet was family. When our lizard Forks wanted to go outside, she would run to the door, head bob, and glare at me, or climb on my boots, until I took her out. Clearly, she had agency and a mind of her own. Take it a step further. How many of you talk to your houseplants or to your garden? How many of you have felt a really deep connection to a particular landscape, one that calls to you at a spiritual level? A tree, a river, a mountain, the great ocean. Somehow that place is more than just a place, bigger than you, and yet connected, even sacred. Even in our disenchanted, materially minded Western consumer culture, we still occasionally experience these moments of transcendent interconnection. Whether we commune with our dog or a tree or the ocean, for a brief moment, we are experiencing part of our human heritage. We know in our bones that we are part of a vast, complex web of human and more than human existence. Modern genetics tells us that life evolved once, 4 billion years ago, and that we and every other life form share a single common ancestor. Animists go farther, recognizing the emotional impact and reciprocal responsibilities of the connections we feel when we look in our dog's eyes or gaze on the endless ocean. We are literally family. Each society describes this instinctive experience of interconnection through its own cultural lens. In Iceland, the Hulda folk live parallel lives to the humans of the material world. Invisible to most human eyes, they act as spiritual moderators between society and the natural world. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, SUNY professor and Potawatomi citizen Robin Wall Kimmerer writes that the Potawatomi language, like other indigenous languages, builds animism directly into their grammar. Traditional English refers to humans as either he or she, and therefore conscious living beings. All other animals, plants, and landforms are it, grammatically unconscious and non-living. Its exist for humans to cut down, eat, dig up, buy, sell, and exploit. Certainly that was the approach of the first European colonists who met the native peoples of the Americas. By contrast, Potawatomi grammar divides the world not into human and non-human, but into living and not living. Humans, animals, plants clearly grow, change, and interact with each other. They are living. So too, in their own way, do rivers, mountains, and oceans. relationship and agency define animacy or livingness in Potawatomi. The entire world vibrates with constant motion, and so Kimmerer noted her despair when she was learning Potawatomi and discovered that the language was 70% verbs rather than 70% nouns like English. Verbs such as wi'igama, to be a bay. She writes, huh? A bay of water is just there. Unless, of course, it's somehow alive and conscious. In English, we have no problem saying to be human. We can even wonder what it's like to be a cat or a dog. Clearly, our pets know. What if we take seriously our instinctive experience of connection, of relationship with the bay, and imagine that it is animate? To be a bay, says Kimmerer, holds the wonder that for this moment, the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers. Because it could do otherwise, become a stream, or an ocean, or a waterfall. And Potawatomi has verbs for that too. Take it a step further, she writes. Imagine seeing your grandmother standing at the stove and saying of her, "It is making soup. It has gray hair." In English, we never refer to our family or any person as it. That would be profoundly disrespectful. It robs the person of selfhood, of kinship, reducing a person to a mere thing. So it is in Potawatomi that, and most other indigenous languages, we use the same words to address the living world as we use for our family, because they are family. Families care for each other, sustain each other. Families put the needs of the group rather than the individual first, which is what made the monstrous Windegos so terrifying. In the winter, when food supplies ran low and snow still lay deep, the specter of isolation, starvation, and madness stalked the Potawatomi. The shape of a man with long white fur, carrion breath, and a heart of ice, Windegos were made, not born. Windegos broke the deepest taboo of indigenous culture. They put their own needs first. They ate another human's flesh. Once a person allowed greed and hunger to overtake them, they became a Windego, cursed to wander forever alone. The more a Windego eats, Kimmerer writes, the more ravenous it becomes, shrieking with its craving, its mind a torture of unmet want. Consumed by consumption, it lays waste to humankind. The eternal hunter and the Icelandic elf woman would recognize Windego. They have seen it before in the thoughtless overconsumption of humanity. Each story calls the people of its own culture to be mindful of the more than human world, or face the consequences. The words consumed by consumption resonate for me. I don't know about you, but I have too much stuff in my house. I broke a screen on my cell phone in December and learned that it was much, much cheaper to buy a new phone than repair the screen. As a culture, we engage in shopping therapy, and politicians and economists assure us that we help our economy to feel better about itself by buying more. And yet the CDC reports that 1 in 3 adults report feeling lonely, and 1 in 4 report not having enough social and emotional support, with all the long-term mental and physical health harm that loneliness brings. Is it possible that we ourselves have been captured by the magic of Windego thinking? Occultist Dione Fortuné once defined magic as the art of causing changes in consciousness in accordance with will. What else would you call a successful marketing campaign? A commercial that convinces you to have a Coke and smile, or to think outside the bun for lunch? Of course, this is not news. Modern culture has wrestled with these questions as well, which brings me to my favorite movie, because, why not? In 2003, the movie Spirited Away became the first Japanese anime film to win an Academy Award for Best Animated Film, and if you haven't seen it, highly recommended. In the film, 10-year-old Chihiro and her family stumble into the Japanese spirit world. When her parents greedily devour food in an empty restaurant and become transformed into pigs, Chihiro embarks on a quest to save them by taking a job in a sumptuous bathhouse where nature spirits come to be cleansed of humanity's pollution. Chihiro confronts a Windego of her own in the character of No-Face. She finds him standing alone in the rain outside the bathhouse and invites him in. No-Face wordlessly offers Chihiro and other members of the staff gold. Chihiro refuses, focusing on her concern for her parents and her friends in the bathhouse, but others greedily accept, begging for more and more wealth. In return, No-Face demands attention, food, and finally he begins eating the staff. After all the while, he calls for Chihiro, the one person who remained concerned with community relationships rather than material wealth. When Chihiro finally comes, she refuses his gifts and instead gives him the magical medicine she had hoped to save for her parents. In the grossest scene in the movie, No-Face vomits the black goo of his greed all over everything, finally barfing up the 3 staff members he ate, who appear still alive, though slimy and much chastened by their experience. It's a Disney movie. As Chihiro says to her friend, "I think being in the bathhouse makes him crazy. He needs to get out of there." The conspicuous consumption surrounding No-Face awakened the Windego hunger for connection that could be never satisfied with food or gold. Purged at last, the lonely No-Face follows Chihiro to the simple, comfortable cottage of the community witch Zeniba. Under Zeniba's wise teaching, No-Face finds a home, a purpose, and the comfort of connection rather than the hunger of consumption. Kimmerer imagines a similar healing for Windego. Traditionally, the Windego was hunted in the scarcity of winter, when its power was strongest. But in one story, the Anishinaabe hero, Nanabozo, hunts the Windego in the summer, in the time of plenty. In that story alone, the Windego is vanquished. The warmth of the sun and the bounty of the earth at last melts its frozen heart. Kimmerer imagines creating a purging medicine that empties the poisonous greed from the monster and replaces it with the wholesome food of strawberries and honey and the gifts of the land. And as the exhausted Windego rests from its healing, she tells it the stories of community, bringing it back into relationship with the world it abandoned and despoiled. In the face of Windego culture of overconsumption and desperate loneliness, we too can build our UU values of interconnection to heal ourselves and the world through an animist worldview. Changes start small, as all spiritual practice does. When I describe trees and flowers and animals in my yard, I talk about the people I live with, my neighbors. I speak of them not as it, but as they. The tiger swallowtail loves our cup plants. I love it when they visit. It felt awkward at first, and occasionally a human will look at me in puzzlement across the flower beds and tell me there were no people there, only rabbits and birds and bugs. It becomes a teachable moment for both of us. Over time, though, I find myself less lonely. I also realize that nature is not just out there in the national parks of Iceland and America, where I took the pictures for these slides. It's growing in the pavement cracks of Philadelphia and Chester, where dandelions offer nectar to bees and butterflies, and even healthy, tasty green leaves for humans to eat. Dandelion salad's actually really good. I need less entertainment from TV when I can watch the family comedy of parent birds trying to teach their chicks to peck for insects along my driveway. It is not as easy as it looks. I need fewer clothes, yet feel more at home in those that I have. When I wear the same things for years, mending them and adapting them as they grow and change with me. And yes, I commune with my house spirits and land spirits, and so far, our local elves seem content. May it be so for all of us. Blessed be and amen.